Okay, thank you very much, Jose. Yeah, so the title has changed somewhat since I submitted the paper, which I guess reflects the scope expanding a little bit, but it's largely the same work. It's very much a work in progress, so I'm very keen to get people's comments and feedback, and I'd just like to thank the organisers for inviting me here to present to you all today. That's also, can I note, my co-authors Antoine Deschelpret in the OECD and LSE, and Rafaela Koch, who worked on this as part of her master's also in the LSE. Okay, can I just pay a nod to our funders? The European Investment Bank funded this project along with, we had partners in CIRED in Paris and in DIW in Berlin, looking at various instruments to finance energy efficiency in the domestic sector. Okay, so to motivate this talk, I'm going to present two somewhat contrasting quotes about energy, recent quotes about energy efficiency. So the first is from Fatih Birol, the executive director of the IEA, who stated that there's no realistic or affordable energy development strategy that is not led by energy efficiency. For the IEA, it is the first fuel. Contrast with that, a recent op-ed article by Sam Ori, who's the executive director of the Energy Policy Institute in the University of Chicago, who describes how government energy efficiency programs sound great, but they often don't work. Okay, so what does he mean by not working? Well, he's really talking about a few recent papers, and there are others, which look at the difference between the predicted energy savings that bottom-up engineering models might estimate, compared with the actual realized savings. So there's a paper by Fowley et al. In 2015, another paper by Alcott and Greenstone, that highlight that actual savings are about 40 to 60% of those predicted. Another recent paper, which summarizes a long literature on the energy efficiency gap by Todd Girardin and others, looks at market failures, behavioral failures, but also the role of model and measurement error in energy efficiency, and describes how unobserved costs and overstated savings from adoption, heterogeneity, inappropriate discount rates, and uncertainty, there are all these factors that contribute to the low adoption rate not being as paradoxical as it first appears. Another recent paper by Matt Cochin in GERI looks at the long-run effects of building regulations and examines how the effects differ depending on the fuel that's been examined and also the time scale that you use. So that's really what we do here. So this is something that hasn't been done so much in energy efficiency, looking at this longer-term effect. So really what we do is we try to explore this heterogeneity and model measurement error and the time consistency in the returns to energy efficiency. So it's very much a descriptive paper based on a data set that we've been working with. And we examine then how this affects the cost effectiveness as measured by the net present value and also the distributional impacts of policies. So we do this by analyzing a database of over 4 million households over an 8-year period to try to systematically explore the returns to energy efficiency upgrades. We use statistical matching and panel econometric estimations to try to control for both selection into the schemes insofar as possible and also unobserved heterogeneity that might cause upgrade households or those households that enroll in the subsidies to be systematically different from those that don't. And a nice feature of this data is that it covers the population of supplier tradable white certificate schemes in the UK, which mitigates against this notion of site selection bias recently raised by Alcott, which essentially states that the savings observed in early evaluations don't necessarily follow for subsequent evaluations. There may be some characteristics of the utilities or their customers that essentially put an upward bias on the early savings. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of background, talk about the data, some results, and the methods we used in some results. In terms of the background, so the UK supplier obligations, they're the principal policy instrument for delivering energy efficiency in the UK and widely used in other European countries. And you can think of them as a hybrid subsidy tax instrument in which households receive a subsidy to install an energy efficiency measure, and the tax is then levied through rising prices by the utilities. So I'm just going to talk about, in terms of the landscape in the UK from 2002 to 2012, so there have been a number of different schemes that have been implemented, starting with the energy, well, not starting, but from 2002 we had the Energy Efficiency Commitment 1, EEC 2, followed by CERT, and then CESP. And CESP, So the difference between these schemes really is magnitude. So EEC1 was, I think, was at an annual cost of about 167 million, whereas CERT to suppliers, CERT at a cost of about 1.1 billion. So the scale of these schemes increased a lot over time. Also, I think from 2002 onwards, or 2005 onwards, there was a specific target group where suppliers were mandated to achieve a certain amount of savings in lower income households. And then the CESP scheme was a specific scheme. There was an area-based scheme that specifically targeted certain areas of deprived households. Okay, so our data set covers 2005 to 2012. So it covers these three schemes here. Okay, in terms of the savings, energy savings generated by these schemes, so based on published evaluations, so insulation, heating, lighting, appliances, and then a range of other measures make up the energy savings. So, and these are predicted ex ante energy savings based on bottom-up building engineering models. So insulation and heating make up between about 64 and 83% of savings over the course of these schemes in our data set. So we have information on insulation and heating. We don't have information on these other measures, but as you can see, the majority of savings were made up by these two investments or measures. So the data we use is the National Energy Efficiency Data Framework, which is compiled by what is now the BEIS, the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. And essentially this is a panel data set with over 4 million households over an 8-year period. And it takes a range of data from a number of different sources. So energy efficiency measures come from the Home Energy Efficiency Database, Ofgem, the energy regulator, and DEC, now known as BEIS. Energy consumption data, so we've metered gas and electricity consumption data on an annual basis from the energy suppliers. Property attributes come from the Valuation Office Agency, and household characteristics come from our model, they come through Experian. So in terms of measures installed, we can see measures increased over the course of our sample from 2005 to 2012. In total, around 150,000 in 2005, right up to nearly 500,000 in 2012, and these measures are cavity wall insulation, loft insulation, and replacement boilers or replacement heating systems. And we can see that energy consumption correspondingly fell during this period. So gas consumption fell by about 27%, and electricity consumption also fell by 14%, although it's difficult to see from the scaling in that graph. But what we want to know is how much of these savings were actually delivered by these measures, and how this changes over time, what is the persistence of these savings, how much uncertainty is there in these returns, and ultimately then how does that affect policy evaluations, and also how it might affect households' investment decisions. So in terms of our identification, so we pre-process the data using statistical matching, so coarse-and exact matching. And essentially what we do is for every household that get an upgrade, that install and measure, we find a control household that is as similar as possible in all observable characteristics. And we use this process called coarse-and exact matching to find, so for each upgrade household, we find a control household that is as close as possible in all observed characteristics. And also, so given that we have such a large sample, we achieve quite a good level of balance on both matched and unmatched variables. Okay, so we then create, for each year of upgrade that we observe, we create a control group, a match control group, and we also do this for the entire sample. So we ultimately end up with multiple upgrade and control groups. Okay, and then we use a fixed effects model to control for any unobserved time invariant heterogeneity, so any other factors that might be essentially correlated with energy consumption or a selection into the scheme, and we estimate multiple different models. So in terms of the matching, maybe the best way to describe it is with these graphs. So taking energy consumption in 2005, this is for an upgrade group and a control group in 2006. We see before matching, the electricity consumption of the upgrade and control group were quite different. After matching, they're pretty much identical. The same with gas consumption. Before matching, we can see the control group has slightly greater consumption than the upgrade group. After matching, we find that they're pretty much identical. And we do this then for each year of upgrade. So we run multiple models. So we can have an upgrade period in 2006, or between 2005, 2006, 6, 7, 2008, 9, 10, and so on. And what we see is that this is the treatment effect post-upgrade. So we can see that the upgrade group, their energy consumption is below that of the control group, and also the parallel paths prior to upgrade, so that there's a similar trend in both upgrade and control group prior to upgrade. Okay, so first we run first difference panel fixed effects estimation, where the dependent variable is the log of energy consumption by household I in year T. So we include household fixed effects, year dummies, a year by region interaction, a treatment dummy, which is DIT, which is can take values 1 to 3, or for each of our different treatment measures, and then our parameter of interest is this delta here, which is the average treatment effect on the treated, which is essentially the effect of the upgrade, and then we have an idiosyncratic error term in our models. Okay, so the first results I'm going to talk about are just main results for the whole sample, and then I'm going to talk about the effect of the upgrades over time. It's the actual versus predicted savings, how this affects the cost effectiveness, and if I have time, say something on the distributional impacts of these measures. So the first thing to say is, looking at the whole sample of upgrades, we can see the cavity wall insulation. So this is on our full sample. We have just under 2 million households. This is matched upgrade and control group, just over 14 million observations. We can see cavity wall insulation reduces energy consumption by about 8%. This is pretty consistent over time, okay, across all years of upgrade. Looking at loft insulation, it reduces by about 2% again, which is pretty consistent over time, independent of when the policy was evaluated. But replacement boilers reduced by an average of about 4%. We observe a significant variation in this over time. So there's something happening towards the later years of our sample, that the boilers installed during these periods are generating higher levels of savings. So in terms of the time, the persistence then of energy savings, so loft insulation observes a reasonably persistent saving over time. Now these measures are estimated to last about 30 years, so loft insulation and cavity wall insulation. Cavity wall insulation observes, once the full treatment effect takes place, it observes a pretty consistent savings over time. Boiler upgrades, after the initial year of upgrade, there seems to be a decrease in the energy savings over time with installing replacement heating systems. So these measures are estimated to last about 12 years. But what we observe is that these tend, in some cases, aren't statistically significantly different from 0 5 or 6 years after they've been installed. So comparing our full sample in this left-hand figure, we can see this is the overall treatment effect over time. But we compare that with different, we decompose our sample into different. One is those households in the most deprived areas. IMD5 are those households in the least deprived areas. And what we see is that for the households in the most deprived areas, we observe smaller treatment effects, and they go towards 0 more quickly. For households in the least deprived areas, we observe larger effects, and they seem to be a little bit more stable over time. Okay, so actual versus predicted savings. So this is a typical UK semi-detached dwelling, and essentially the standard assessment procedure is a bottom-up engineering model developed by the Building Research Establishment to estimate the expected energy consumption in kilowatt hours per meter squared per year for dwelling, and that delivers you an energy score, which is then converted into an energy efficiency rating. Okay, so based on published data from the BRE SAP models, we can look at predicted savings for a typical semi-detached dwelling, and we can compare that with our actual estimated results from our matched sample. And what we find that for each of these measures, so that the SAP prediction for cavity wall insulation is 5,153 kilowatt hours per year. So we find that when we're comparing to our matched sample, the actual savings are about 23% of what the model estimates would have predicted. For loft insulation, it's about 12%. For boiler replacements, it's about 25%. Just for comparison, if we include results of the unmatched sample, we can see that essentially these are slightly closer to what the models would predict, but still quite a long way off. Our results really aren't that, comparing our results to a number of other papers, more so in the engineering literature, we can see that we're more or less to the middle of a range of other papers that have been published in this area. Okay, so how does this affect the cost effectiveness of upgrades? So, well, ultimately this depends on how you expect the evolution of future prices, what path you expect that to take, and also what discount rates you use. So using a simple net present value formula where we looked at the discounted future cash flows from these energy savings minus the upfront cost, taking some cost assumptions from a range of published reports and papers that have been kind of conducted over the last number of years. And we don't make any assumptions about the evolution of future prices, but just observe that gas prices rose significantly over the period of our sample. So we just look at a range of options, which basically starting with a minus 5% to a plus 5% increase in energy prices. And we find that cavity wall insulation is broadly net present value positive. So this is if prices remain the same. This is the net present value if prices rise. This is if prices fall. And these are the discount rates at which we discount future savings. So I include 3.5% just because it is the recommended UK government discount rate for public infrastructure evaluations. So we find that cavity wall insulation is broadly net present value positive. Loft insulation is it really depends on what we expect, where we expect future prices to go. So unless future prices rise significantly, loft insulation is not net present value positive. And these investments in boilers, so really, and obviously this is assuming a 30-year lifespan for cavity wall insulation and loft insulation. Boiler lifespans have been assumed to last about 12 years in the engineering literature and in these evaluations. But if we assume that they last 12 years, these measures have been broadly positive, but 6 years they have been largely negative. Okay, so in terms of the distributional impacts, really the main thing to say here is that on the histogram here on the left-hand side is the average annual savings in terms of pounds for each of these groups. For boiler replacements, it's about 25%. Just for comparison, if we include results of the unmatched sample, we can see that essentially these are slightly closer to what the models would predict, but still quite a long way off. Our results really aren't that, comparing our results to a number of other papers, more so in the engineering literature, we can see that we're more or less to the middle of a range of other papers that have been published in this area. Okay, so how does this affect the cost effectiveness of upgrades? So, well, ultimately this depends on how you expect the evolution of future prices, what path you expect that to take, and also what discount rates you use. So using a simple net present value formula where we looked at the discounted future cash flows from these energy savings minus the upfront cost, taking some cost assumptions from a range of published reports and papers that have been kind of conducted over the last number of years. And we don't make any assumptions about the evolution of future prices, but just observe that gas prices rose significantly over the period of our sample. So we just look at a range of options, which basically starting with a minus 5% to a plus 5% increase in energy prices. And we find that cavity wall insulation is broadly net present value positive. So this is if prices remain the same. This is the net present value if prices rise. This is if prices fall. And these are the discount rates at which we discount future savings. So I include 3.5% just because it is the recommended UK government discount rate for public infrastructure evaluations. So we find that cavity wall insulation is broadly net present value positive. Loft insulation is it really depends on what we expect, where we expect future prices to go. So unless future prices rise significantly, loft insulation is not net present value positive. And these investments in boilers, so really, and obviously this is assuming a 30-year lifespan for cavity wall insulation and loft insulation. Boiler lifespans have been assumed to last about 12 years in the engineering literature and in these evaluations. But if we assume that they last 12 years, these measures have been broadly positive, but 6 years they have been largely negative. Okay, so in terms of the distributional impacts, really the main thing to say here is that on the histogram here on the left-hand side is the average annual savings in terms of pounds for each of these groups, these deprivation groups. And we see that savings are concentrated in the larger income groups, but policy costs, this is taken from a paper by Chawla and Pollitt, which they essentially created a data set of policy costs in order to estimate the proportion of policy costs, or policy costs as a proportion of income for various different income groups. What we essentially find is that policy costs are disproportionately levied on lower income households, but energy savings are disproportionately concentrated in the higher income groups. Electricity savings are very low, so I won't say much about them, but it's kind of a similar effect. So to summarize then, so really this, it's a very descriptive paper. We explore this heterogeneity, the model measurement error, and this persistence in energy savings and how it affects the net present value of measures and the distributional impacts of policies. So we find a significant difference between predicted and actual. The payoffs to energy efficiency are lower than models would suggest, but despite this, measures are generally profitable. The measures installed as part of the UK supplier obligations appear to have had a regressive impact. This is despite explicit targets to achieve certain proportions of savings in lower income groups. But again, this is very much a work in progress. So just to say thank you for your time, and I'd greatly appreciate any questions or comments. Thank you very much.